All right. Hey guys, welcome back. And today we'll be talking about the Indian Wars. This is the series of scattered conflicts in the areas west of the Mississippi River after the Civil War up till the 1890s, the closing of the frontier. Uh, I refer you to historian Frederick Jackson Turner, who wrote the thesis about the closing of the frontier, very important thesis that said that by the 1890s, the West was won. And part of that struggle was defeating the Native Americans. Remember that it's the federal government that's going to be focusing its efforts on doing this by sending in the cavalry. And that's not a euphemism. I mean, literally, they sent in the United States military's cavalry. So, yeah, we had outposts and forts like in Kansas at Fort Laramie, from which our cavalry is going to go out and hunt down Native Americans. And that is what they did. We've talked about a long time, since colonization, since the 1600s, how Native Americans have been pushed west and west and west as that western frontier expanded, as the nation has grown. Well, by this time, it's the last of the frontier. Natives who have been pushed this far west, and tribes who already lived out here, this is their last chance at retaining any sovereignty for themselves. And so this is what they are up against, as you have the railroad companies and like the Transcontinental Railroad, as you have the US Cavalry, as you have homesteaders by the hundreds of thousands coming onto their lands, and these various trails like the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, bringing these settlers out into Indian lands. The importance of the horse. I know, this is Ramsey here. I love horses. They're my favorite animal. I probably talk about them way too much, but that's not true because you can't talk about the horse too much, right? But the importance of the horse cannot be understated when it came to these Plains Indian tribes. Now, the horse itself was not indigenous to North America. I think we talked about this last semester briefly, but remember that the horse actually, like most animals, originated in Africa, Asia, and it migrated across the Bering Strait when it was that land bridge, Beringia, tens of thousands of years ago during like the last ice age. And the horse slowly populated the Americas, but it was hunted to extinction long ago by the native peoples. And so when Christopher Columbus and the first European explorers, when they first came to the Americas, there were no horses that were natural to this area. They had to bring them over, which they did. The Spanish conquistadors were the first to bring the horses over. And eventually, over decades and over the centuries, from 1492 up till the 1800s, where we're at now in the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, many bands of wild horses have formed in the Western lands, escaped from Spanish missions and from native raids. The Native American understands the value of this creature, that before they had to been forced to hunt on foot these giant buffalo. And we talked about last time with the cattle boom in Texas and the Chisholm Trail that put our city of Waco on the map and built our suspension bridge. That a cow, a longhorn, weighs about 1 ton, 2,000 pounds. Buffalo are much larger bison, animals, bovine animals. They are huge. They weigh anywhere from 3,500, even more pounds. So they are enormous animals. Hunting them on foot was exceptionally dangerous and took an entire hunting party the better part of weeks to hunt down a single buffalo or two. They would oftentimes have to drive a herd off of a cliff, and it would be devastating for the local herds, and they would take them a while to have to relocate. Getting the horse from the Europeans, the Plains Native American tribes were totally transformed. Hunting on horseback, carrying out war on horseback. Quickly, the Plains tribes became like some of the best horsemen in the world in just a matter of a generation or two. And many of these Plains tribes, like the famous Nez Perce, who are up in the Northwest, they began to breed selectively for the best horses, the best traits: speed, endurance, hardiness, um, you know, uh, cool coat colors, all sorts of things like that. They valued. You're going to have among the United States cavalry officers that are sent to go hunt down the Native Americans and clear the West, basically for settlement, groups of African American soldiers that were sent out to do this. And they were known as the Buffalo Soldiers. There's a picture of them right here in the middle of the screen. Let me get rid of this. There you go. So those are the Buffalo Soldiers, and they were called that because one of the tactics that the United States assumed in its war against the Plains Indian tribes, and again, there's many different Plains Indian tribes. You could talk about the Sioux up in the north. You could talk about the Lakota. You could talk about the Cheyenne. You could talk about the Comanche here in Texas. You could talk about the Apache. There were many, many different Plains tribes. So we're talking about that. It's all these different groups. And keep in mind that many of these tribes, they were fiercely independent. And that's part of the reason that they struggled to amass a counterattack to the United States, is that they were independent tribes who hadn't naturally banded together. They'd fought wars against one another for centuries. And so that's one other thing to consider. But the overall tactic, one of the overall tactics that the United States military assumes, thanks to generals like Philip H. Sheridan, was to destroy the Indian source of food, the buffalo. And so the reason why like these black soldiers were nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers was because the United States waged war against the buffalo. They will literally hunt the buffalo nearly to extinction. Of the hundreds of herds, of the thousands and thousands of animals that had existed before the Civil War, by the 1880s, it is down to literally just a few herds left. And in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, we began to slowly protect the buffalo, the bison, and try to bring those herds back up in population so that tourists, who go to Yellowstone today can still see and visit them. They're majestic, giant, amazing creatures. But you can see that, like from this photo here, it was serious game business. It wasn't just to try to hurt the Native Americans by taking away their food source. It was also a very profitable business. The buffalo hides were prized back in the East. Buffalo horns were prized, aesthetic uh, trophy to have in one's house. The buffalo they were hunted nearly to extinction. Now, there will be some tribes that will fight back, and there will be some tribes that try negotiating. It's kind of like, remember, with the 5 civilized tribes with Andrew Jackson, how 3 of the tribes, left and agreed to some monetary settlement versus the Cherokee, who chose to fight it out in the courts. And they failed, and they had the Trail of Tears. You also had the Seminoles that fought back. Different tribes tried different things. One of the most famous tribes that tried to basically negotiate, and when that didn't work, instead of fighting back, they tried to flee. And this was a 1,000-mile escape spree from around Idaho and Montana, trying desperately to get to Canada to escape to the Canadian border. This was the tribe known as the Nez Perce. And I really like the Nez Perce because their chief Joseph, obviously he was very caring of his people, not wanting them all to die, so he led them on this giant escape. But also they were like I'd mentioned, horse breeders, some of the best horse breeders in all of the Native American tribes. And the most famous breed of the Nez Perce that they created was the Appaloosa horse, which today is an American registered identified breed, known for its beautiful spots, usually on its rear end and on its back. And so that's the Appaloosa horse, bred to be extremely hardy, um, extreme endurance. They can live off of less than normal horses. That's Spanish breeding in them, and they can run for a lot longer. They have some of the Arab blood. And so with their Appaloosa horse, several thousand of the Nez Perce tried this desperate escape, and they were able to outlast the United States cavalry for, like I said, almost 1,000 miles. It was one of the most daring, impressive attempts for escape of any story in all the Indian wars. But finally, the U.S. cavalry catches the Nez Perce just 40 miles outside of the Canadian border. And instead of fighting and resisting and probably sacrificing his people, Chief Joseph basically agrees to surrender and take his people to the reservations in Oklahoma, Indian country. And this is where he gives a very famous speech where he says, "I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are all killed. Our old men are all dead. It is cold and we have no blankets." Yeah, they're up like by Canada. "The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills, have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, maybe freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs, I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I shall fight no more forever." And they go down to Indian country defeated. It was the Nez Perce. And then you had the opposite approach of other various tribes, famously the Sioux, in a giant collaboration with the Lakota and other tribes, led by multiple chieftains, including the very famous Sitting Bull from the Dakotas and the famous warrior chieftain Crazy Horse that they have an enormous monument to that they've been working on forever. You could see it right there, the statue for Crazy Horse. They're going to launch a massive assault against the 7th Cavalry Division, led by famous General George Armstrong Custer. Now, Custer had been a Union general during the Civil War, known for his ambitious frontal assaults. He is fearless, and he is also very cocksure. This guy had great designs and ambitions for himself, political aspirations even. His wife was also from a very political family. I mean, it's not going so far to say that Custer envisioned himself one day maybe running for president of the United States. And as we've seen throughout American history, one of the ways that this is made possible is through becoming a war hero, making a name for yourself in war. And so that's what Custer was hoping to do in the Indian Wars, because he had fought bravely in the Civil War, but he hadn't won any major accolades. So he is desperate and hungry for fights against the natives to make a name for himself. And that's maybe helping to explain why he goes so far out of the way, jeopardizing his division. But Custer and his 200 something men, they are in Montana, and this is an area that the Native Americans, they called the greasy grass, because it was this, you can see this bottom right hand picture, long tall blades of amber grass, wheat blowing in the wind. So that's the greasy grass. And for the United States, we're going to call this the Battle of Little Bighorn, because it was by the Bighorn River. But I think most people, if you've heard of this battle, you might know it by even a different name, a third name, just called Custer's Last Stand. And it's very famous. You know, last stands, we've talked about this like with the Alamo, or like in world history, the Battle of Thermopylae. They're very famous because it's fascinating that every single defender dies to the last. And that is what happens to Custer and his men. He has a scouting party. He finds Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and their warriors, and he vastly underestimates just how big the size of this encampment was. Totaling the women and children that were with Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, there were thousands of Native Americans. And Custer he totally underestimates the numbers, and he goes in, guns blazing, and gets completely surrounded. Native Americans at this time, they're fighting on horseback. They do have guns, but most of the time they would be overwhelmed by the U.S. cavalry. This is one of those rare instances where the opposite was true. And Custer and his men, they're surrounded, and they get completely overwhelmed. At Last Stand Hill, a little grassy knoll on this grassy plain, Custer and his officers, they do the ultimate sacrifice that a cavalryman can give. They shoot their horses to provide bulwark against the Native American barrage of bullets and arrows. And then finally they are overcome And the natives, once they've killed every last man, including General Custer, they scalped them. Um, Scalping was a tradition brought over from Europe. It was a way to prove you had captured a bounty. And so this was the fate of Custard and his men. They were scalped there. And word of this travels back quickly to the east, to Washington. And although this was a huge victory for the Native Americans, it just was that. It was one victory in a series of defeats. And it's also going to help to galvanize the United States military against the Plains tribes, showing that, hey, they should not be taken for granted. So we need to attack them with overwhelming force. This took place in 1876. The flight of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce with their Appaloosa horses was also 1876, 1877. This is kind of the height of the Indian War, and skirmishes and fights like this will continue on for the next several years. Like I said, by the 1890s, most of the fighting is done. Most of the tribes have either been defeated, killed, or surrendered and forced to go to reservations. And that is the Indian Wars. One last other brief thing I want to mention, the pictures here. There's a picture of George Armstrong Custer. He was very much the type of man who liked to look good and have his picture taken. I think behind Abraham Lincoln, Custer is one of the most pictured, most photographed Union leaders in the Civil War. Not that he, was that high ranking in the Civil War, but more because of his ego. And then this picture right here of this horse, this is the horse named Comanche. Ironic because, this was a Union cavalryman's horse named after the Native American tribe. But this horse Comanche, this little brown bay gelding, he actually is the only survivor of the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand. All the men are killed of Custer. Custer's killed. And this one horse, maybe the Native Americans might have captured some of the other horses. I'm sure they did. But this was the only survivor that the rest of the cavalry division found when they came across the scene of the carnage and the scalpings and all the dead bodies. This one horse was still breathing, still living. He had arrow holes all over him, blood all over him, but he survived, and they nursed him back to health. And Comanche kind of lived out the rest of his days as a relic and an icon of the Indian War. They took him to Fort Laramie in Kansas, and he enjoyed a very nice retirement. He was never allowed to be ridden again, and they gave him lots of beer. Beer comes from like wheat and stuff. Horses actually like it, and not too healthy though. Please don't feed that to your horse. Might make them colic. And when he died, as gross as this is, it's true. They actually stuffed his body to preserve him for all time. And today you can find Comanche. There he is, what he looks like today. This horse from 1876, preserved pretty well behind glass at the University of Kansas Veterinary School. That was actually where my mom went to veterinary school at. K-State. University of Kansas, Kansas State University. It's one of those, but the one that has the vet school, I think it's Kansas State University. I don't know. It's in Kansas. It's really cold there in the winter. Anyway, so that's the Battle of Little Bighorn and Custer's last stand. Most of the time, though, the Indians lose the war. And as the West was cleared of Native Americans, and as more and more miners, prospectors, farmers, and ranchers go out and settle the Western lands, you have the development of these Western states, such as Nebraska, Colorado, North and South Dakota. Remember, gold was discovered there in the Black Hills. Montana, where that Battle of Little Bighorn took place, Washington State, which is in the far northwest of the United States, beautiful, beautiful country there, where Seattle is. Idaho, where the Nez Perce were, the Walla Walla Valley, there in Oregon. Wyoming, and we talked about, remember, like Utah in 1896. And so all these Western states are coming into being during this time period as the West is being cleared. You also have the beginning of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to handle these Native Americans, their issues on the reservations. And then you have please highlight or star or in your notes somehow, please denote, this is a big deal, the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, okay? The Dawes Act is going to break up tribal land into 160-acre parcels to be distributed to Indian families, with the remainder auctioned off to white purchasers. Now, typically, the land that was given to Native Americans would be the kind of, pardon my French, but crappy land, and the land that would be given to the white settlers would be the really good parts of the land with, resources, valuable land. 160 acres should be ringing some bells for familiarity, by the way. Remember, 160 acres is the same amount of land for the Homestead Act. And it's kind of similar here. But the point behind the Dawes Act, why you're giving these Native Americans 160-acre tracts of land for a Native American man and his family, or 80-acre tracts of land for a young Native American man who was single, or 40 acres for an orphaned Indian boy. The reason that they were dividing up the land and giving it to Native Americans like this was because they were trying to assimilate the Native Americans as well as take their land. And so if Native Americans agreed to adopt the habits of civilized society, which meant AKA act like the white American man, meaning convert to Christianity, agree to change your dressing and clothing and hair and your outward appearance. So they'd have to cut their hair, they'd have to wear suits and ties and dress like Western American people. And they'd have to learn to speak English. If they could agree to assimilate, to adopt these habits and conform to American society, then they would be given this land. And the biggest way they're being forced to conform is land ownership itself. If you own the land, that is a very white man's view of land ownership. Remember, Native American tribes, they did not have this view. For Native Americans, the land belonged to everyone. The land was shared by everyone and for everyone's benefit. And so forcing natives to own the land like the white man, that was one of the biggest ways that they were being forced to assimilate under the Dawes Act. And so that's going to be a big part of the government's policy towards Native Americans. It was the idea of assimilation, and the saying behind it was, kill the Indian, save the man. And you can see in like the Carlisle School, it was an orphanage for Native Americans whose parents were killed during the Indian Wars back in the East. And these boarding schools were very common, not just the Carlisle School, but there were many of these. You could see these young Native American boys who are teenagers, probably have grown up in the school. They have all had their hair cut. They're in like, athletic uniforms. They have been assimilated, forced assimilation, basically. And then as far as taking the Native Americans' land through the Dawes Act, once you had divided up the tribal land in these 160-acre or less plots to the Native Americans who had assimilated or adopted the habits of the white man, then all the rest of the land that had been the tribes was now distributed to white settlers. And that is literally how about 2/3 of all Native American land was lost and taken by the United States. So that was a really big deal. That's the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. So that's 1887. By the 1890s, you have the beginning of the ghost dance movement, as Native Americans have basically lost the Indian Wars, and they are very few and far between as far as being free. They've almost given up all hope, and the ghost dance is kind of their last effort to try to bring back hope and their society. It was a movement of many different tribes that would come together and have a dance, basically, of mourning, of sadness, of despair, and basically praying to their deities or to whoever would listen to please kick out the white man and return the land to how it once was. That was the ghost dance movement. And while they were having one of these ghost dance movements in the 1890s in the Dakotas, you had a terrible massacre of the Native Americans participating in this. Mostly women, children, and old men were killed, over 100 of them at Wounded Knee. There's a very famous book about this called Buried My Heart at Wounded Knee. You can see the picture here on the right of the mass graves of these Native American civilians, not warriors, who were killed by the US military there. It wasn't a battle as it's often referred to, it was a massacre. It started like a lot of issues where you have um, the military guarding these Native Americans as they were participating in a ghost dance, and one of the soldiers got nervous as the Native American had a gun, and he thought that he was going to fire at him, so he fired first, and then everybody started firing. And when the dust settled, it was mostly just these women, children, and old men that were dead. That was Wounded Knee. And Wounded Knee kind of marks the end of the Indian War. And we will be talking about Native Americans further in this class. There are some very important things we've yet to talk about. Going along with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we're going to, where was that? Did I skip a slide? There, it is right there. I don't know what the problem is. But we're going to be talking about the development of the reservations and their sovereignty going into the 1930s. We will talk more about Native Americans fighting for more rights and for cultural pride and to get their land back, which is a movement that begins during the civil rights era in the 1960s and 70s by Native Americans called the Red Power Movement. But we'll be talking more about that stuff later. Here is another picture from the Carlisle School, the Native American Indian Orphanage Boarding School. You could see here on the left is the picture of the Native American children, probably recently taken from the West and put into this Eastern boarding school. And then here on the right is the picture of these same Native American boys now with their haircuts being forced to assimilate. And remember, that's a big part of the Dawes Act. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the idea behind assimilation for the natives. In this picture here, you have in green all the various reservations. And these are some of the reservations that still exist today. You have the Blackfeet, the Spokane. You have around here, this is near the Grand Canyon, and the Navajo, the Hopi. They run some very amazing tourist attractions along the Grand Canyon, actually right here, the Hualapai. I actually have been with the Hualapai on a tour that they gave in the Grand Canyon, including these waterfalls and these caves and stuff. Like, it's amazing. But if you ever do get a chance to go onto an Indian reservation, the first thing you'll probably notice is the poverty. They were given land that nobody else really wanted, that didn't have many valuable resources. And so Native Americans, since they were put on these reservations, have struggled to find enough funding to support their people. Some have adopted by creating alternative revenue sources, such as the casinos, which are allowed because today reservations function as their own sovereign entities, separate from the United States government, although still somewhat under it. But that is the situation that Native Americans are going to find themselves in. And that is why Frederick Jackson Turner says in his famous thesis that the West was closed, the frontier was closed by the 1890s as the last of the Native Americans were defeated. All right, next time we'll be talking about Gilded Age politics. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate your time, and I'll talk to you later.